The following presentation is based on content from my new book, The Great Gold and Silver Rush of the 21st Century. To read the free online chapters or order the book, please go to ggsr21.com. Thanks. Welcome to Part 3 of Chapter 4 of The Great Gold and Silver Rush of the 21st Century, the $200 billion gift you never intended to give. Reserves not required. The banks used to have reserves. This was something that from the very beginning of banking, there was some reserves that you had to keep, even though you were basically committing a fraud and the currency that was being deposited wasn't actually there. It becomes the bank's property. It's a liability of the bank because they owe it back to you someday. But it's not there as your property. So anyway, formerly, the banks were required to hold a minimum level of reserves against their liabilities, and anything above that was referred to as excess reserves. But in March of 2021, they reduced their reserve requirements to zero. You can see that here where this little purple area goes to zero. They eliminated reserve requirements. There's no more required reserves. Therefore, they are all now excess reserves, basically, because they aren't required to have any. And this includes vault cash. And, so the currency, if you want to go and get dollars, the banks are no longer required to have some currency on hand, some paper currency. If you look real close on this chart, you'll see a little tiny blip right there. And that's Alan Greenspan's response to 9/11. These are all the bank reserves that get stuck in their reserve accounts because of the process of QE. And so all of this is there. It's an accident that this is there. Getting back to the quote from the Bank of England, the additional reserves are a byproduct of QE. So all of these reserves sitting here, they're stuck there. It's not something they intended on. They got accidentally or unintentionally stuck there. A reserve inflation correlation beyond the imagination. During the 4 years preceding the global financial crisis of 2008, total excess reserves of commercial banks typically averaged $1.7 billion, and that's billion with a B. In September and December of 2021, bank reserves topped $4.27 trillion with a T. It was an inflation of excess reserve IOUs of roughly 2,500 times. In the chart that I showed you earlier of all of the excess reserves that have piled up, before 2008, other than that, the big mountain of excess reserves that are stuck there and the little blip from Alan Greenspan's response to 9/11, other than those, you can barely see the excess reserves. Banks didn't want excess reserves. For the first 94 years of its operation, the Federal Reserve didn't pay the banks interest on the excess reserves. They were just basically a liability sitting there. But in October of 2008, Ben Bernanke started paying the commercial banks interest on their base currency IOUs, all of the reserves that are stuck there. And all of these banks started earning interest on that enormous pile of reserves. So whether it's the Fed or the Bank of England, the goal of QE is to pump newly imagined IOUs into the financial sector, artificially inflating asset prices. The enormous piles of bank reserves are simply a side effect of QE, a byproduct, something that banks never previously wanted, but Ben Bernanke changed all that. The trillions of dollars of reserves now pay interest, and the banks look upon them as a gift that keeps on giving. And I'll give you one guess as to who is footing the bill. It's you. Here's the same graph, but now I've included, I've overlaid the interest rate on top of it. And the problem is I can't keep up with it fast enough. Since we made this graph, and this graph, we keep on updating it and trying to get the book out, and then they change the interest rate. So this is already outdated, but it just keeps on going north. Here's the chart of the cumulative amount of payments that we have made to the banks of over $200 billion. And now it's shooting for the moon because whenever we try to raise rates and tighten up things and slow down the inflation and so on, the interest rate is going up. So when they're doing all of this tightening and talking tough, it's literally raining free IOUs on the banks. And right now, this is just absolutely shooting for the moon. So you can see that it's over 200 billion is the cumulative amount, but now we're already growing at a pace where we're paying them more than 100 billion per year. And it's only accelerating. When I saw this, though, I had to ask myself, where does the Fed get the currency to pay the interest? Because they can't just print currency. That's against the rules. They have a balance sheet. The balance sheet must always balance. Assets minus liabilities and capital must always net out to zero. And since every IOU is a liability, it means they must always acquire an offsetting asset whenever they create an IOU. Therefore, central banks can only create currency by acquiring assets. So where did they get the currency to pay the interest? And the answer is that it comes from their profits. And where do they get profits? All of the assets they buy pay interest. That's where the profits come from. What are those assets? They're mostly U.S. Treasuries and mortgage-backed securities. Who pays the principal and interest on those U.S. Treasuries and mortgage-backed securities? You. I'm sorry I'm laughing, because this is a really sad situation. When the U.S. Treasury issues a bond, it's borrowing currency from the buyer of the bond and promising to pay the buyer back plus interest, and the funds to pay the buyer back come from your taxes. Mortgage-backed securities are just a bunch of mortgages bundled up and securitized so they can be sold to an investor. What gives the mortgage-backed security its value is your mortgage payment. And when I wrote this, about 70% of the Fed's assets were U.S. Treasuries and 30% of their assets were mortgage-backed securities. Therefore, about 70% of the interest that the Federal Reserve pays to the banks comes from your taxes, and about 30% of this interest paid to the banks comes from your mortgage payments. Now, these aren't exact because these yields vary, but basically that's the idea. The Fed is basically taking currency from you through your future taxes and your mortgage payments and giving it to the banks on these excess reserves that were an accident. They're not really supposed to be there. It's just part of the way the system is set up. At the end of 2022, the interest on reserve balances was 4.4%, and reserves were averaging $3 trillion. And I don't care who you are, 4.4% interest on $3 trillion is some serious cash. This gift of free currency to the banks is now $132 billion per year, which is $11 billion per month. And it's all coming out of your pocket. Who knows how much it'll be by the time you watch this video or read this chapter, but I do know one thing. It is all coming out of your pocket, and it's even worse than that, because you're going to be paying for it twice, and so are your children. According to the Federal Reserve's charter, it is first supposed to deduct its business expenses and then pay dividends to its stockholders, and its stockholders are the members of the member banks of the Federal Reserve System. And it pays them a 6% dividend on their investment, the capital that they have to put up. And then they're supposed to turn over all profits to the U.S. Treasury to reduce our national debt, to reduce the annual deficit, reduce the national debt. Now, every week, the Fed used to pay the Treasury a couple of $2 billion, but since the interest rate on reserve balances exceeded 3% in September of 2022, the Federal Reserve started experiencing some significant losses, and they just keep on booking them to this account that is remittances due to the U.S. Treasury, and it's gone negative. They used to have an amount of profit and pay it out, have it and pay it out, And so that's the reason this line is flat. But since they can no longer pay it out, it's accumulating as a loss that they just book there. And so this means that the Fed is basically insolvent, but it's okay because they'll just book it in this account and rob it from other places. The Treasury will get by. But because this was a gift to the banks and not turned over to the Treasury, it means our national debt is higher than it should be by the exact amount that was paid to the banks. So not only did we give all of those billions to the banks through taxes due on the bonds that currently exist, but the Treasury had to replace the lost revenue by issuing the same amount of offsetting bonds that you and your children will be paying taxes on for many, many years to come. So again, as I said before, if you are not angry, you're not paying attention. I want to thank you for watching this part. We'll see you in the next part. Thanks for watching, but this is by no means the whole story. If you want the full story, including my free online-only chapters and companion videos, there's a wealth of information at ggsr21.com. Thanks.